Okay, so my name is Eric Robinson. I'm one of the librarians at the University of St. Augustine. I began on the San Marcos campus, but recently moved into a position as scholarly communications librarian. So I do both faculty and student instruction, continue to do library instruction, but my focus is primarily with distance learning students and with scholarly communications issues. So wanted to do a brief presentation on how you can raise your scholarly profile, different things that you can do to increase how people are able to access your work, how often you're cited, how you can use citation statistics and things to make your case when it comes time for your faculty evaluations, if you're faculty, or if you're a graduating student starting to engage in research, you can start planning for those things, okay? I basically got it laid out as a number of kind of topics that sort of all interweave with each other. So we'll talk about actual online profiles and social media, and then where those overlap with open access databases and things. So just to go ahead and get started then, one of the first things that you can do is to create an actual online account to sort of act as your scholarly profile. There are a couple different ways that you can do that, and I'll talk about a few of them, but there's a number of them out there. Basically, simply these things kind of act as a virtual CV. So you can list, typically on these, you can list your university affiliations, you can list your publications. Many of them allow you to list conference presentations or distinctions or things like that. But it's a nice way, regardless of which, if you only use one, regardless of which one you use, it's a nice way to bring all of your work together, particularly given that many publications require that you publish, the way that they format your author name might vary. So bringing all of your various author names together, if you've published under a maiden name and now have a married name that you go by, you can list all of those together on your site. And it's a way to bring those together so that individuals know that Mary Jones is now Mary Smith, and those are actually the same person, and these are all of that person's papers. So it's a nice way to bring everything together that way and tie it directly to your identity. Basically, I like to think of them as a lot of people are familiar with the digital object identifier or a URL for a website. This is essentially a URL or a digital object identifier for you as a scholar. And these are available online. Typically, you can control what's linked to that, how those are brought together. But if somebody is interested in your work and they want to see what else you've done, it's a way for that person to bring that all together, and they can see, maybe you've done a follow-up of this study, or you've done another project on a similar topic, or maybe they want to contact you to get at your data, or to communicate with you or collaborate with you. So bringing that all together for researchers and readers in one place, and allowing them to connect to you both through your work and to connect with you and literally contact you and talk to you if you'd like. You can also, when you're listing all these publications, typically there'll be a way to link either directly to the publisher's website or to a university repository where an individual could actually access the full text of that. That may or may not be behind a publications subscription wall, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But it is a way for them to go directly from your identity page out to the publications themselves and access the work. We'll talk more about open access and how you can make them more available in a minute. But that's the basic idea behind these scholarly account profiles. And, there's a number of them out there. I'm going to go through, I think, 3. They literally take a few seconds to a minute to register, to get your name in there. If you want to go back and curate that and list all your individual publication names, or tie in all of your work and link out to everything, then that can take a little more time, but you can get them up and running in literally 30 seconds. One of the biggest ones, you may or may not be familiar with this side of Google Scholar, but on Google Scholar you can create your own scholarly profile, list all your works in there, and again link out to those. One of the main benefits of Google Scholar is that many people are accessing that very, very regularly. So whether it's a manuscript or a manuscript in preparation or a working paper or something, or a policy paper or an actual research article publication, you can link all of these into here. And within Google Scholar, they'll also sort of calculate citations within, at least within the Google Scholar scope. I'll talk more about how those citations are calculated later, but typically within a certain set of reference journals, those citations will be counted. Obviously, they have to be counting something, so what they're counting varies depending on who's doing the calculation. But Google Scholar is a pretty thorough one, and they use some very common metrics there that are useful when we're talking about citation statistics later. Just quick on here, you can see institutional affiliation, publications with full reference information. These links link into Google Scholar and then out to full text if it's available. The other thing is the citations here listed by year, listed by H-index or I-10, which we'll talk about. They're just different ways of calculating a citation impact. And also really importantly, if you're looking to connect to your researchers, you can follow an individual researcher on here. So I have a number of individuals that I'm following, particularly in library science and philosophy and open access issues. So anytime they publish a new work and it gets added to their profile, I'm alerted to that. That's a really useful feature as a researcher, but useful to you as a scholar because it gets people more familiar with your work. ORCID ID is another one. I'm particularly fond of this one, I think, because of the way it displays partially. It really displays just like a CV, but they do, they basically give you a URL that's sort of your online unique identifier, and then you build your profile on that. It does allow you to, it's a little small on this probably, but you can see capturing all of the variant publication names that you might be publishing under, so you can bring those together. You can cross-link to other online IDs, so you can link to your Google Scholar or a researcher ID or Scopus, and then not only bring all your papers together on your ORCID ID, but bring all your online IDs together as well. The other thing that I particularly like about ORCID is it gives you can add whatever you want into your profile, but you can see on this little sort of privacy bar here, at every level, whether it's employment, education, publications, you can choose who sees that, whether it's just you yourself, whether it's public, or whether it's only approved. So individuals that have connected with you and you said, yeah, they can see these. So if there's a publication out there that maybe you're not so proud of, or that you want to shield one thing or another for whatever privacy reasons you might have, that option is available to you, and I'm quite happy with how that functions. Scopus is another one that allows the creation of those online identifier profiles. It's pretty straightforward, very similar to the Google Docs. They will sort of create these author pages within the references of Scopus, but you can go in and say, this is me, and take control of what gets identified with it. again, many of these things are already being done by Google, by Scopus, by Web of Science, but for you to step in and say, this is me, these are my papers, and I want to have some control over what gets linked, and maybe even bring in more together that they can identify themselves in an automated way, allows you to do that as well. This one also allows for the citation. It typically does an H-index for a citation count. I'll give you details about what all those citation indexes mean later, but essentially they're an impact, citation impact, how often your work is being referred to in the literature, hopefully of your field. But Scopus is just another one of those. The next thing, other than setting up an online ID and beginning to sort of build and affiliate your publications with that, the other really big thing that you can do is to get involved and begin sharing your work through open access. You may or may not be familiar with it. I think there's a lot of misinformation and confusion out there. We do have some open access webinars available on the library website, but the main thing you want to know from here is that this is a publication model, very legitimate publication model in its form, that rather than selling the published product to the reader at the end of the whole process, the publisher allows the reader to access that for free. So we've all experienced the frustration of stepping into our research and finding the perfect paper and clicking on it, whether it's through our library or through the web, and you see this thing thrown up that says pay $35 to access this article. This is a way to get around that, and there's a particular economic model behind it. Obviously, there has to be some financial support for the publishers to be able to do that. Typically, that's done through a processing charge to the author or to an institution when an article is accepted, and that way it can be provided for free to the reader at the end. Again, there's a lot more to be said about open access. I could do a 2-hour presentation on that, but there are some resources out there, and I'll give you some tools to learn more about that as well. The big thing is, as a researcher, when you're trying to promote your work and really make things available and get people looking at your work and citing your work, by placing it in some sort of open access publisher or repository, those individuals that can get to it free are more likely to access your work than they are if they hit those paywalls that you see all the time. So by providing it for free or providing it within this framework, you'll have more people able to get to your work, and you'll have more people citing your work. The one thing I really want to drive home in my very brief discussion of what open access is, a lot of people sort of confuse that model for predatory publishing. And by predatory publishing, I mean a less than ethical publisher who charges you a large fee and delivers really shoddy work, or there's no real peer review process. They're just sort of cranking papers out and turning over their bank account really quickly. So that exists within the open access model, but they are not the same. Many very legitimate open access publishers do charge a substantial publication fee to the author or to a publishing institution so that they can provide free access to the reader. But that sort of how they go about that and the processes, the sort of ethical and best practices for publication that they engage in really is what dictates whether an open access publisher is predatory or not. Again, there are many very legitimate open access journals and publishers out there. I mentioned previously that You can increase your rate of citation by placing in open access, just because that's more freely available. There have been a number of studies out there. This is one of the kind of clearest advantage, sort of clearest graph that I can show to demonstrate that advantage. So this is basically taking by individual field and looking at, if an article is available open access, how often is it cited? If it's stuck behind a publisher's paywall, how often is it cited? And there's obviously significant variation between different academic disciplines, but many are cited 2 to 3 times as much. Most fields show a small citation advantage, so maybe it'll be cited 20% more often than if they weren't behind the paywall. Since we're a health sciences university on here, we're looking at about a 50% increase. So if your paper would normally be cited 10 times, if you put it in an open access repository, that same paper might be cited 15 times. So fairly substantial increase in those overall. There have been a couple of studies, more than a couple, I should say, a number of studies that look at that and try to tease out whether there really is a citation advantage or not. The vast majority of these studies do show some citation advantage. Obviously, again, significant variation between academic disciplines. There have been a few that show no citation advantage, and there's a number that really discuss kind of biases and how that plays to the actual citation advantage. But the vast majority of them are showing some level of advantage with that. But I don't want to present the case that it's cut and dry, because there are some issues there. So how can you take advantage of that? The easiest thing you can do is to submit to an open access repository. By that, I mean essentially a website that allows that user to download whatever papers you put there for free. That can, early on, this was done through personal websites. A lot of scholars created their own website, and they would just upload manuscripts to their website so that people can download them. There's a number of repositories out there that are dedicated to a particular subject discipline. There's one for nursing, for example. PubMed Central is, I'm sure you're familiar with Medline or PubMed, and the free text that's typically or very often available through PubMed Central. That's essentially making that available through PubMed Central and the National Institutes of Health is essentially a legal requirement for federally funded research at this point. So those subject-specific repositories, professional organizations occasionally. So if you're a member of a professional organization, that organization may or may not have their own subject-specific repository. But the vast majority of individuals that are taking part in this are doing that through a local institution. So typically the university or a healthcare institution or a research organization will create their own repository, and all of their members, all of their faculty can freely deposit their work there. We certainly at the University of St. Augustine are quite excited, because over the last year we've implemented one of these for our university. Ours is called SOAR at USA. It stands for the Scholarship and Open Access Repository. The URL there is on the screen there, so you can pull that up. But this allows you can log in here and click on Submit Research, and you can see the list of subjects there. Just barely cut off at the bottom, you can see we've also got student dissertations or scholarly projects that we're including. But you can log into the SOAR at USA way, and as long as you're affiliated with the university, whether as a student or as a researcher or faculty member, you can deposit a manuscript, whether it's a preprint or I'll talk about preprints and postprints in a minute, but poster presentations from conferences that you've presented can be loaded into there. any of your scholarly output that you'd like to communicate is what we're collecting in there, and it's quite simple for you to submit to that. One of the questions that people often have is, if I do that, can I publish it later? Typically, most publishers vary fairly wildly in how they approach that. Most will allow at least a preprint to be deposited in an institutional repository or on a personal website or whatever. That means kind of the manuscript that you submitted to them, whether that's before or after it's gone through the whole refereeing process and accepted for publication. It could either be before the refereeing, after essentially the final draft that they're going to publish. Some will even allow it to be published in its final form, so exactly the PDF that they would post on the publisher's website. Sometimes you can include that. Very often it's some form in between the original manuscript and the final publication. There's a website called Sherpa Romeo that allows you to search individual journal titles and see what their policies are regarding whether or not you can archive preprints or postprints. So it's a good, when you're considering submitting to a journal for publication, if you want to and I would encourage you to do this, if you want to retain some sort of open access rights, you can check Sherpa Romeo and see which publishers would allow for that. I mentioned a couple subject repositories. I think the most common ones for our purposes are PubMed Central, which I mentioned before, the Virginia Henderson repository, which is a dedicated nursing subject repository, and Sport Archive, which it's sort of a cross between sports and sports medicine. So some rehabilitative stuff, but particularly with a sport focus, are some of the subject repositories that I've turned up in my searches. There are a couple directories online where if you're looking for a subject repository, you can go in and search them by subject. OpenDOAR is one of those. It's a directory of open access repositories, or the Open Access Directory at Simmons University. Neither one of those is terribly friendly when it comes to searching those, but you can limit them by subject and locate repositories in your subject field if you're interested in that. The directory of open access journals, if you're looking for journals to publish in. I mentioned Sherpa Romeo as a source for searching access rights, but the DOAJ also lists the open access policies, gives some detail about their peer review process, and is also searchable by subject. So if you want to find open access journals in rehabilitation, physical therapy, you can do a subject search of that. This is a little more user-friendly, I think, but unfortunately it's for journals rather than repositories. But given that most people are using an institutional repository primarily, and then maybe a subject repository as secondarily, I think the DOAJ is more useful when you're looking to find a journal that you'd like to publish in that does allow open access. All right, a couple of resources if you're interested in learning about open access. I hesitated to make this too much a presentation about open access, but it is one of the single biggest things you can do to increase your citation rates and people being aware of you as a researcher, because that's accessible out there. ACRL, the Association of College and Research Libraries, has a really great website that is kind of an introduction to open access issues. Everything from scholarly publishing to copyright to the different open access models is all captured there really well. So if you just want a brief overview, I'd encourage you to link up with that and at least browse it to get yourself oriented to open access. They also list a number of publications, monographic publications, books that are available. Both of these are available as open access, so you can download a PDF or HTML of these books. They are published in print if you'd like to pay for it, but kind of the point is an argument for open access. These are both excellent. The Access Principle by John Walensky, he's a pretty major researcher in scholarly publication. That is a very, very solid argument for why we should be doing everything as open access now, or as much as possible. Definitely encourage you to at least take a look at it if you're interested. He makes a very, very strong case. The Peter Suber book, the black one there, is just a real layperson's introduction to open access. So if you just want a really good overview of what it is and what it is and why it is, the Suber book is terrific. Last year there was a movie released called Paywall, which looks at the business of scholarship, the sort of the profits of the major publishers and the resistance by libraries and by scholars to engage more deeply in that. So sort of the birth of the open access movement within scholarly publication. But they look at the for-profit publication side, they look at predation, and they look at how you can build open access. That is available also, freely available online. They've got a Vimeo site that's linked there that you can go out to. It's about an hour and a half long, but lots of good information if it's a topic that's new to you. The third big thing that you can do as a scholar is to be aware of the rights that you hold as an author. I would love to do another one of these sessions on copyright itself or on retaining author rights, but I got a few quick things in here. Just understanding the basics of copyright, the idea that once you set something down, it doesn't need to be published by a publisher somewhere for you to own for you to have a copyright on it. Simply by setting it down in a tangible form, and that includes digitally, you own that copyright. Typically when scholars are publishing, and you may have engaged in this already, in order to get your work out there, you'll pass that copyright over to a publisher. But there are ways, both in negotiating those contracts and in just being aware of what rights you can sort of stand up for, to retain your rights to distribute that as you see fit, to retain rights to reuse images in your work, regardless of whether they're published by a for-profit publisher or not. Typically that takes the term of some sort of non-exclusivity clause, so you might grant them the right to publish it, but you're not giving the copyright over to them. You're allowing them to non-exclusively share your work, but that retains for you the right to share your work in whatever way you would still like to. Some publishers will dig their heels in a little bit, but there's some resources out there that allow you to kind of negotiate more with them. The easiest thing to do is just add a simple addenda to any publishing contract that you might receive. Again, I'd love to go into more detail on this, but I'll refer you to a couple of sources. But a simple, 1 or 2 page thing that you say, I need this added to the contract when you come sign to publish it. When it comes time to publish that, to sign those contracts, that can make all the difference in how you're able to share those manuscripts later. Another thing is to consider Creative Commons licensing. This is a sort of a digital push for the remixing environment of the internet that came about in the early 2000s, 2010s or so. A brilliant young man named Aaron Swartz and Lawrence Lessig, who is a copyright lawyer, put together essentially a really simple toolkit online to allow people to attach essentially a contract to anything that they share online and give people a sort of proactive license to do things with that work according to the author's wishes. So I'll talk more about that here. You might see these kinds of images around quite a bit. It allows you as an author to share your work, to put that out there, and to give people advance permission to share that work, to make derivative works from it, if you choose to do that. It allows you to sort of create these just real simple selections. Yes, you can do whatever you want with it, just attribute it to me. You can limit it to non-commercial, and you can limit them from sort of changing it or create what's called derivative works. So basically, if you go into Creative Commons, you kind of just go through, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this, and it generates a little thing like this, and you can attach that to a web page or to a document, and people see that and they know that they have the right to share that work if you choose, if you've given them that. It's just a very clear and very simple way for you to give that advance permission, so that the users don't have to contact you and say, oh, I really like to use this chart. How do I go about licensing that from you? You can give them that permission as long as they attribute it to you, or as long as they're doing it for non-commercial purposes. The other thing I mentioned is that author addendum. SPARC, which is a Scholarly Publishers Association coalition, they put out a simple brochure that I think is very understandable about how to retain key rights to your work. They have some tips for how you might negotiate with your publishers. They do have that simple addendum that I talked about. I think the addendum and the idea of approaching a publisher and saying, hey, it's really important to me that I retain these rights for these purposes. They do a really good job of laying out why you might want to do that, and how you can communicate that straightforwardly and negotiate that with the publishers when you do publish. Another thing that is useful, although I think its utility is limited, which is why it's far down my list here, is understanding citation metrics. So essentially, this is how you're measuring how your work is being cited, how many people are downloading it, whether it's being mentioned in social media or whatever. So understanding how these citation metrics are calculated so that you can understand what it is that these numbers are telling you when you look at them is certainly important. You can also use these when you're signing up for your professional review and filling out whatever paperwork. You've published this many papers and you have an H index of, whatever your H index is. You can use those to make the argument that yes, you are a substantial player in your field. One of the key things to understand about them is the way that they're calculated typically has some sort of frame within it. So when you're talking about impact factor, for example, that's one of the citation calculations that was quite common until fairly recently. That those are when they're calculated, the individuals that are calculating them are looking at a particular subset of the literature. So just to take impact factor, for example, that's published by the Journal of Citation Reports, and they're looking at a particular subset of all the journals that are being published. So that impact factor doesn't take into account if you're being mentioned in maybe some policy documents, or people are sharing your work all over traditional media or social media. that scope isn't taken into account in some of those. Just to kind of give you that background for how these things are being calculated. And then a couple of the most common ones I've got here, H-index is used quite commonly now. It's almost replaced impact factor, I think. This is the highest number of your papers that have been cited that same number of times within a prior period. So H5 would be within the previous 5 years. That's one that Google Scholar uses quite commonly. So for example, you might have a scientist who has published 70 papers. Some of those have been cited 100 times. Some of them have been cited twice, maybe not at all, but 37 of them have been cited 37 times. So that's a sort of a way to show that a sizable number of the papers are being cited a sizable number of times, and sort of playing that balancing factor gives you a number that's called the H-index that you can give some weight to, saying that has an impact. Impact factor is one that received a lot of focus in the sort of pre-digital period. Essentially, they looked at the previous 2 years of a particular journal subset and how many times you were cited in that previous 2 years. So for 2018, they would look back at 2017 and 2016. So your 2018 impact factor might be 75. You had your papers published in the previous 2 years received 75 citations. So again, you see how these are all quite similar. The I-10 is a really straightforward one. It's the number of papers you have with 10 or more citations. And then the SNP is essentially like the H-index and the impact factor. The calculation's a lot more complicated, which is why I don't even try to describe it here. Essentially what that does is gives a statistic that allows you to compare apples to apples across academic disciplines. So given certain citation practices, you might have in the humanities or in even English versus history, there might be a different sort of standard of how often individuals are cited for different things, and that varies pretty significantly across academic disciplines. So what the SNP does, the source normalized impact, is takes that number and then normalizes it across all disciplines, so that a SNP of 37 means the same thing in the humanities that it does in the medical sciences, or that it does in the physical sciences. Where if you take H-index or impact factor, you might have an impact factor of 3 that means, hey, that's amazing in one field, but you're expected to have something above 10 or 20 in a different academic discipline. So the level of that effect is normalized with the SNP. Does that make sense? The last metric that I'd want to mention is altmetrics. So you may have seen these little rosettes or flowers, they're sometimes called, tacked all over particularly databases and publisher sites and things. It's a more recent way of capturing impact beyond the research publication literature. So it brings in mainstream media, social media, public policy, and theoretically each one of these colors within that rosette represent, Twitter or social media or government policy documents or research literature, and then they add those all up to give the number that's in the center. It's worth being aware of because it is pretty prevalent, and you can actually use that to check out your citations and your altmetric on a given paper. So if you navigate to within one of the databases to a paper of yours, they have this altmetric bookmarklet that you basically save as a bookmark within your browser, and then when that's open, when you're open in the database looking at your article, you can click that bookmarklet and it'll kind of run that list that into the altmetric site and bring up a number for that article. So when you're sort of gauging where your research is and then kind of going back and revisiting it, it's kind of a nice way to, oh, the paper that I shared on my Facebook page last week just went from 3 to 75 on my altmetric. So it's a nice kind of immediate gratification way to see some of that, because a lot of those mainstream media and social media shares might not be captured, or will be captured much more quickly than say another research publication citing you 6 or 8 months later. Just to bring it back to your scholarly profile, looking back at Albert Einstein's scholar profile in Google, you can see individual citations here in this section, paper by paper. So this is the total citations within other things listed in Google Scholar. And then over here, they've got the H index and the I-10 index calculated for that scholar as well. Most profiles will have some form of that, but I think that's a really good example of how that gets incorporated into your academic profile. So I just wanted to sum up quickly, look to you guys to see if anybody has any questions at this point. I don't see anything. So one of the things that I kind of would like to offer to your, oh good, there, now I'm seeing some chat. I'm not sure if anything changed, but when I was asking for chat earlier, I wasn't seeing any. One of the things I'd like to offer you to kind of get involved with this, and the real simple steps that you can take to make some changes here, is just a simple 5-day challenge to do one thing a day, whether it's once a week. Maybe you do it on Monday morning, you spend 5 or 10 minutes doing this, or maybe you do Monday through Friday. I don't care how you do it. I just encourage you to kind of dip in and take some control and start engaging with this stuff to see what effect it has. Day one, real simple. Just Google yourself in Google Scholar. Take a look at everything that appears in Google. If you're searching your name, your institutional affiliation, make sure that everything's updated. If individuals are trying to contact you about your research, you want them to have your current institution on your LinkedIn page, if you've got that. Any publications on, if you have a personal website, the contact information on that is up to date. See what shows up under your name in Google Scholar. When you're creating a profile, they'll suggest a number of things that might be you, and then you can go through and pick out which ones are. But just Google yourself right off the bat and see how many of your publications are appearing there. You might see more come in later as you take some of the other steps that we talk about later. Take a peek at the individual citations in Google Scholar for those publications, kind of tracking how that changes over time, seeing what sort of sweet spots and what things you might have done to affect a large change in that, whether it's presenting at a conference or sharing something in open access. You might see those numbers jump right after you did something, and that's a good way to know that it's a good thing to do. Any publications in there, ideally, they would be easy to find and accessible. If it shows up in Google Scholar, ideally, it would be great if the publisher allowed it, or if you have some open access deposit somewhere that an individual can just link on it and get a PDF of that document as soon as they see it there. They don't have to jump through any hoops with their institution or with the publisher, or have to pay for that information. You want them to be able to get it as freely and as simply as possible. So day one is just kind of taking a look and seeing what that looks like, kind of keeping that in the back of your mind as you go through these other things. Day two would be to, if you haven't already, many people might already have one, choose one of these things and create a scholarly profile. ORCID or Google Scholar are probably the ones that I would recommend. but there are others out there. There's the Scopus profile. I think there's a researcher ID, which is through Clarivate, or Clarivate. I can never pronounce that correctly. But do create one. If you've already got one, maybe create another, or maybe go into the one that you've got and tighten it up. Start listing any publications, conference presentations that you've published. If you've got 3 things, you can do it in 5 minutes. If you've got 100, you might want to spread that out a little bit. Many of them can be automatically imported. If you've got a DOI or a URL, including that will help people link out to them more immediately. And again, I mentioned most of these profiles allow you to link in other profiles. So share your ORCID ID with your Scholar, with your researcher ID profile. Get all that information connected up. Individuals that can find you in one can then find you in the other, and that increases your visibility as a scholar. A number of these allow you to export a little snippet of code. Like if you were to embed a video in YouTube or something, you can export this little bit of code, tap that into your website, and add a badge or your ORCID ID that then is listed in your LinkedIn site or in your faculty page that then links directly to that CV setup. And that's a good way for you to link all that work to your web page, wherever that might be. Day 3, start thinking about open access. So if you've got things out there that you have published, go to Sherpa Romeo, and take a look at some of the journals and see what their open access policies are. You might be concerned about depositing something in a repository because you've already published it, but you go on there and you find out that the journal you published in allows you to publish the final version in a repository, or they might allow you to publish a post-print or a pre-referee print or something. Some individuals will want to get to that final published form, but individuals that don't want to pay for it will then have access to at least the basic information, the document, the manuscript that you submitted to the publisher, if not a more finalized form. So if you have any questions about Sherpa Romeo, you can certainly contact me, or that SOAR@usa.edu is the scholarly communications librarian thing, sort of a universal one to attach to the repository. But anything that goes in there will come to me directly. So I'd be happy to answer any questions you have navigating Sherpa Romeo. And the repository too, which we're getting to next. So day 4, you've kind of looked at your publications, you know what you've got, they're linked to your profile. Start getting it out there in open access. Get some works added to the SOAR@USA website. Or if you want to do a subject repository, or if you have a personal web page, consider getting some form of your works available in open access, and you can see within SOAR, you can see how many times that's been downloaded from the repository. So that's an easy way to kind of track stats on there as well. Typically, the things that people are going to add in here are a lot of times conference posters, maybe write-ups of a conference presentation, manuscripts that have been submitted for publication, manuscripts that have been accepted for publication. Again, potentially subject to the preprints or postprints of the publisher. But again, if you're working with that kind of SPARC author publication contract addendum, what might have been initially denied you if you had just gone through the publisher's normal publication, you might be able to retain these rights and still publish with that publisher. So do keep that in mind when you're negotiating your contracts, that you would like potentially to be able to take part in these things. And tie these back to your scholarly profile. So if there's a DOI or a URL, you can have those linked into your profile, and then the individuals can link from your profile directly into the repository. Again, if you have any questions about the institutional repository, how to submit work, if you have copyright questions, you'd like some assistance navigating that, again, please feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to help you through it. I think once you've gone through it once or twice, maybe 3 times, it becomes quite straightforward. So happy to walk you through your first couple if you need to. The last day, kind of thinking about moving forward. So the directory of open access journals I mentioned. When you're thinking about publishing, if you'd like to publish in an open access journal, so that work is freely available, the DOAJ is a site that you can go to locate journals that publish in your field. So you can go to doaj.org and search rehabilitation or physical therapy or nursing and find 20 or 30 open access journals. You can view their editorial policies, their peer review policies, see what their open access policies are, what they allow as far as repository archiving like that. So day 5, I'd encourage you to locate a couple of journals in your field and consider publishing through those venues rather than maybe some of the for-profit publishers. I'm sorry, I shouldn't contrast it with for-profit, but rather than the traditional publishing models that do charge individuals to access. Okay, that's pretty much my spiel. You can contact me with any questions. I'm happy to assist you with navigating SOAR. Happy to assist you with finding your way through Sherpa Romeo, which is really useful, or the DOAJ. Any questions you might have, you can email me. Before we break, I'd like to ask, looks like I got 3 or 4 people in here now. It's a way, Deb. The question was, is DOAJ the best way to locate a journal in your field? There's a couple of different ways. If you're looking to identify a thing for a place to publish, I believe I got some information from you, Deb, that I was going to respond to this evening that can go into a little more detail. But I think to answer your question, I'll say it's a way. Particularly to identify an open access publisher, if that's what you want to do. If you're talking about finding reputable journals in the field, or finding journals with a high acceptance rate, something like that, then there's some other things. But I think this is not necessarily the venue for that. Any other questions? All right. Well, again, please feel free to contact me. I'm open to working with you, sitting down one-on-one, virtually or in person if you're available in California. But we do online meetings through Skype or through Blackboard all the time. So I'd be happy to work with you on that. And I hope you will take advantage of SOAR and start building up some sort of profile that really brings your stuff together. All right. Good luck. Thanks for coming out. Have a good night.